This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to the latest in the top 10 by decade ranking experiment. Here in part 13, our focus is on the Bantamweight division. And as always, we will be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 bantamweights from each decade. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the bantamweight division in 1924. So for our purposes here, we're going to begin with the first full decade with a complete data set of rankings, the 1930s. At the conclusion of 1930, these were the top-rated bantamweights according to Ring Magazine. Panama Al Brown is the first name on the list, and he will receive 10 points. We continue scoring points in decreasing value until we get to the 10th name, Harry Fioro, and he gets 1 point. On this list there are 10 names, other times it's 11 or more, but we are only concerned with the top 10 names listed. If we go ahead and do this for every year from 1930 through 1939, the final result looks like this. Panama Al Brown finished first with an even 50 points, and he was considered the best of the class for a 5-year stretch. Sixto Escobar and Lou Salica had good scores in second and third place, and in ninth place we have Harry Jeffra, and this is his second top 10 finish, as Jeffra was also on the 1940s featherweight top 10. Moving on to the 1940s bantamweights, Manuel Ortiz had an extraordinary 88-point total. That's an incredible score from Ortiz, and he is now just the 8th boxer to ever score 80 or more in a single decade. And that's the 3rd highest score that anyone has achieved in any decade for any of the weight classes we covered so far. This is also the 2nd consecutive year that Lou Salica finished as a top 10 in this division. Then looking at the 1950s, Mario Degada finished first with 42 points. And just quickly looking at this list from the 50s, you can see that nobody had a particularly long stretch of dominance. Degada and Macias were considered top 10 for 5 out of 10 years, and Degada was only considered the best in one of those 5. Moving along to the 1960s, Eder Joffrey topped the list with 59 points. He was considered the best for 5 consecutive years. Joffrey also finished as a top featherweight in the 70s, so that's 2 top 10 finishes for him. And for Piero Royo and Alphonse Halimi, this is the 2nd consecutive decade that each of them finished as a top 10 in this weight class. Then in the 1970s, Carlos Zarate had the top score with 42 points. Finishing in 9th place, we have Lupe Pintor, who also finished as a top 10 junior featherweight in the 1980s. And then tied for 10th, we have Eusebio Pedroza, and this is the 3rd top 10 finish for him. He was also a top 10 featherweight in both the 1970s and the 1980s. That marks Pedroza as the 21st boxer to finish in 3 or more top 10 lists so far. Moving ahead to the 1980s, Alberto Davila was first with 43 points. Davila was never considered the best, but he was considered among the best for 7 straight years. He beat out Jeff Chandler, who was considered the best at the conclusion of 4 different years, but Chandler spent less time in the weight class, and that's the main difference between the top 2. This is the 2nd consecutive top 10 finish for Pintor as a bantamweight, so that makes 3 top 10 finishes with him, and he's now the 22nd boxer with this distinction. Now looking at the 1990s, Jorge Alese Julio topped the list with an impressive 54-point total. And we have a similar thing happening here that we had in the last decade, where Julio was never considered the best, but he finished ahead of Orlando Canizales, and Canizales was viewed as the best over a 4-year stretch. On to the double O's, Virapol Sahaprom scored an impressive 69-point total. He comfortably beat out Rafael Marquez, who had an impressive 54-point total of his own. This is the third consecutive decade where we've seen the guy finishing first, having never been considered the best, whereas the next guy on the list was considered the best at least for a few consecutive years. For Sahaprom and Tim Austin, this was their second consecutive decade as top 10 bantamweights. Then through the end of 2017, the current bantamweight list looks like this. Anselmo Moreno is the current leader with a hefty 60-point total, and this is his second consecutive top 10 finish as a bantamweight. It's also another top 10 finish overall for Nonito Donaire. Donaire was also a top 10 junior featherweight in the current decade, but we will just have to wait and see how things play out here before anything gets finalized. Regarding the most dominant decade for a bantamweight under this scoring criteria, as mentioned earlier, Manuel Ortiz had one of the highest totals we have ever seen. He did benefit from the inherent World War II bias, but he was still considered the best of the class for several years after the war. I mentioned earlier he is now the 8th boxer to score 80 or more in a single decade from any weight class. It's probably worth noting that 3 of the other 7 were also from the 1940s. So make of that what you will regarding the World War II bias for anyone who held a title during the war years when they were frozen. In total, there were 7 bantamweights to appear in the top 10 for multiple decades. And in this instance, I'm not sure anyone truly stands out among these standouts. I guess Moreno and Sahaprom both each had first place finishes, so I guess that separates them from the rest. And if we add up all the totals of all the bantamweight decades we covered here today, the final result looks like this. Manuel Ortiz and Virapol Sahaprom are tied for first with 96 points. Then Anselmo Moreno and Lou Salica are tied for third with 78 points. Eder Joffrey was 6th place here, but I think most observers would be inclined to have him higher on this list, nearer to the top if not at the very top. But under this scoring system, Ortiz and Sahaprom scored the highest. So going forward with the ranking experiment, we have just 4 weight classes left to go, and only one of those from the original 8. After that, it will be 9 quick decade recaps from the 1920s through the double O's, and finally, after that, it will be the grand finale top 100 countdown, where we will calculate all of the point totals that every boxer has ever accumulated under this scoring system. And we're going to go through the top 100, where I show everyone exactly where the points are coming from. And while this scoring system is a far cry from perfect, I really am very interested in seeing the final results. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for part 14 of the ranking experiment. Next up, the junior bantamweight division. Take care and have a great night.